What started as a few quiet tears on an ordinary school bus was about to uncover a horror no child should ever have to survive, and the only person who noticed it in time was a 62-year-old driver who had spent most of his life fixing broken engines. Never imagining that one day he would be forced to help save a broken girl. Every afternoon, as the yellow school bus rolled through the quiet suburban streets outside Columbus, Ohio, Eldrick Boone followed the same routine with the same steady patience that had defined him for years. He checked his mirrors, watched the road, listened to the thunder of teenage voices rising and falling behind him, and made sure every student got home safely. It was simple work, but after decades as a mechanic, it had given him something he had not expected to need so badly at his age: purpose. He knew the rhythm of the route, the usual noise, the careless laughter, the restless energy of kids desperate to escape another day of school. He also knew when something did not fit. That was why he noticed the girl. She always sat near the front, 3 rows behind him, close enough to stay out of trouble but far enough to avoid attention. She was new, the kind of student who still carried the invisible weight of not belonging anywhere yet. Her name on the route sheet was Maren Vale, 14 years old, recently transferred, assigned to his bus only 2 weeks earlier. At first, Eldrick had assumed her silence came from being the new kid. Plenty of children withdrew into themselves when dropped into a different school, different classmates, different streets, different expectations. But by the second week, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Maren did not just sit quietly. She folded into herself as if trying to disappear. And every afternoon, as the bus emptied and the noise faded, she began to cry. She never did it loudly. She never wiped her face in a way meant to be seen. She kept her head lowered, letting her hair fall like a curtain, her shoulders slightly hunched, her breathing tight and uneven. But Eldrick saw everything through the mirror. He saw the quick movement of her hand across her cheek. He saw the tremble in her jaw. He saw the way she waited until fewer students remained before letting the tears come harder, as if even her grief needed permission to exist. It happened once, then again, then a third day in a row, and by then the concern had settled into his chest like a stone. On that third afternoon, the feeling grew worse. The bus rattled over a shallow dip in the road, and while the remaining students argued about weekend plans and phone videos, Eldrick glanced up at the mirror and caught Maren bending down sharply toward the floor. Her hand disappeared beneath the seat in front of her. For a moment she stayed there too long, as if feeling for something hidden out of sight. Then a faint metallic sound clicked from the front section of the bus. It was soft, but in the half-empty vehicle it stood out enough to make Eldrick's eyes narrow. Maren straightened too fast, startled, her face going pale even from the limited view he had of it. The movement was wrong. Not careless. Not accidental. Defensive. Eldrick kept driving, but the unease sharpened. He had raised children of his own. He had spent enough years around young people to recognize the difference between sorrow, fear, and shame. Maren was not just having a hard time adjusting to a new school. Something had its hands around her life, squeezing tighter each day, and whatever it was had already taught her to hide. By the time the last few students got off, the bus had gone unnaturally quiet. The afternoon sun stretched long bars of gold across the aisle. Dust drifted in the light. The ordinary comfort of routine was gone, replaced by the heavy feeling that he was driving toward something he would not be able to forget once he saw it clearly. Maren remained in her seat until her stop approached, clutching her backpack in both hands. When the bus finally pulled up in front of her house, Eldrick took in the scene with one quick, practiced glance. A faded 2-story home sat at the end of a quiet street, ordinary enough to disappear among the others. A trimmed lawn. A cracked walkway. Closed curtains. Nothing about it looked dangerous. That was the part that bothered him most. Maren stepped off slowly, and when she passed him, Eldrick saw what the mirror had failed to show. Her eyes were swollen. Dark shadows sagged beneath them. Her face had the strained, exhausted look of someone far older than 14, someone who had not slept well in a long time and no longer expected comfort from anyone. She kept her gaze down and moved as if every second spent being looked at hurt. Eldrick watched her reach the sidewalk, and in that moment he made the decision that changed everything. He climbed down from the bus and followed her a few steps, not close enough to frighten her, only enough to let her know that someone had finally noticed. He tried to reach her carefully, hoping that kindness might open the door that fear had slammed shut. But the reaction on her face when she turned back stopped him cold. It was not annoyance. It was not embarrassment. It was fear. Pure, immediate fear. The kind that flashed across the eyes before a person could hide it. It vanished quickly, buried under a tight denial, but Eldrick had already seen it, and once seen, it could not be dismissed. Before he could go further, the front door opened. A man stepped onto the porch with the stiff stillness of someone who did not like surprises. He was in his 40s, broad through the shoulders, expression flat in a way that did not feel calm, only controlled. His eyes moved first to the girl, then to Eldrick, and there was no confusion in them, only irritation that someone from the outside had crossed too close. This was Thaddeus Crowe, Marin's stepfather, though Eldrick would only learn the name seconds later. The man's presence changed the entire air around the house. Marin seemed to shrink toward the steps. Her pace quickened. Whatever fragile space might have existed for honesty vanished the instant he appeared. Eldrick introduced himself and explained what he had noticed, choosing his words with care. He did not accuse. He did not push. He simply raised concern about the girl's emotional state. Thaddeus answered with a story polished enough to sound reasonable. A recent death in the family. A grieving teenager. A difficult adjustment. The kind of explanation society accepts because it allows everyone to step back and feel relieved. But there was something dead behind the man's eyes when he delivered it, something that did not belong in the face of a grieving parent. No sorrow. No tenderness. No protective instinct. Only impatience. Only the cold desire to end the conversation and seal the door. And then the door closed. That should have been the end of it. For most people, it would have been. A bus driver had done his part, shown concern, spoken to the guardian, and received an answer. That was enough to let the world move on. But Eldrick stood there for a second too long, staring at the house, because his instincts were screaming that he had just been handed a lie wrapped in politeness. The girl's frightened eyes, the hidden tears, the strange movement beneath the seat, the stepfather's emotionless explanation, all of it pressed together into one unbearable suspicion. He could not prove anything. He had no evidence. Only a feeling. Only the hard-earned sense, sharpened by age and by years of reading trouble before it fully surfaced, that a child was drowning in front of him while everyone else called it rain. He returned to the bus with that feeling growing heavier, not lighter. As he drove back toward the depot, the streets blurred past without meaning. He replayed the scene again and again, testing the man's explanation against the image of Marin's face. It did not hold. Nothing about it held. The girl had looked less like someone grieving and more like someone trapped. By the time he parked and began his end-of-day inspection, his concern had hardened into determination. He moved down the aisle collecting crushed snack bags, abandoned worksheets, and empty bottles, doing the same job he did every day, but with his thoughts fixed on one seat near the front of the bus. The seat where Marin always sat. The seat where she had bent down in secret. The seat where something had clicked underneath. When Eldrick finally reached it, he stopped and stared for a moment, the silence of the empty bus wrapping tightly around him. The late sunlight had faded. The interior seemed dimmer now, smaller, more enclosed. He crouched slowly, joints aching, and examined the vent beneath the seat. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But then he noticed a slight gap, barely visible unless someone was looking for it. He slid his fingers into the narrow space and felt something hidden inside. And the moment his fingertips touched plastic, he knew with chilling certainty that Maren Vale had not been crying over an ordinary grief. She had been carrying a secret too dangerous to leave in her own home, and Eldrick Boone was seconds away from finding the first piece of it. Eldrick Boone pulled the hidden object out from beneath the seat with slow, careful fingers, and the second it caught the fading light inside the empty bus, the unease that had followed him all afternoon turned into something much heavier. It was a small packet of birth control pills, partly used, sealed in thin plastic and tucked deep enough into the vent that it had clearly been hidden there on purpose. For a long moment, he stayed crouched beside the seat, staring at it as if the thing might somehow explain itself if he looked hard enough. But it did not explain anything. It only made the entire picture darker. A 14-year-old girl did not secretly hide birth control pills under a school bus seat without a reason. That was the thought that hit him first. The second thought was worse. Maren had not looked rebellious, careless, or reckless. She had looked exhausted, frightened, and cornered. The pills did not feel like the sign of some hidden teenage romance. They felt like evidence of panic, the desperate move of a child trying to solve an adult nightmare with the wrong tool and no one safe to guide her. Eldrick turned the packet over in his hand, reading the label, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. He was not a doctor. He was not a police officer. He was just a bus driver who had happened to notice tears where others had seen silence. But he knew enough to understand that this discovery changed everything. He took several pictures of the packet and the vent where he had found it, making sure the angle showed exactly where it had been hidden. His old mechanic's instincts had taught him to document what mattered before anyone could question it later. Then he sat heavily in the driver's seat, the bus suddenly feeling far too still around him, and tried to think. The school should know. Someone in authority should step in. That seemed obvious. But obvious things had a way of moving too slowly when children were involved, and every minute he sat there, he could still see Maren's face in his mind, pale and drawn, her eyes begging for help while her mouth refused to say a word. He sent the photos to the principal, Rowan Hale, along with a short message explaining where he had found the pills and which student had been sitting there. After sending it, he waited for a response that did not come. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to make him call. The principal answered, but the conversation left Eldrick colder than before. Rather than urgency, he got impatience. Rather than concern, he got irritation at being interrupted during a meeting. Eldrick kept his explanation brief but direct, saying he had found something disturbing linked to one of the students on his route and that it needed immediate attention. Rowan brushed it aside, promising he would look later, the kind of answer meant to end a problem instead of face it. When the call ended, Eldrick sat staring at his phone in disbelief. That was the first moment he realized he might be alone in this. He locked up the bus, turned in the keys, and walked to his old sedan with the pills still in his pocket, feeling the weight of them far more than their size should have allowed. He told himself there were procedures, that he had done what he was supposed to do, that the responsible people would take it from here. But the lie did not last even halfway to the exit. His route home would pass within minutes of Maren's neighborhood. He knew that. He also knew he would not sleep that night if he drove past and did nothing more. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the light changed at the intersection. For a moment he kept going. Then conscience hit harder than common sense, and he turned the car around. When he reached the house again, the street looked wrong in a different way. The home stood quiet, the curtains drawn, no sign of movement inside. It had been less than an hour since he had dropped Maren off, yet the place already felt abandoned. Eldrick parked at the curb and walked to the front door, knocking firmly, then again louder when nobody came. Still nothing. He circled his gaze across the windows, The porch, the driveway. No answer. No sound. No ordinary signs of a family at home. He returned to the car, pulled out the emergency contact sheet kept for students on his route, and called the number listed for Thaddeus Crowe. It rang several times before going to voicemail. He did not leave a message. Something about the silence made his skin crawl. He drove away, though not with peace of mind. The pills were still in his pocket. The unanswered door, the cold stepfather, the uncaring principal, all of it was starting to form a pattern. He had not gone far when chance handed him something he could not ignore. Near a small pharmacy on the edge of a commercial strip, he spotted Maren walking alone along the sidewalk. She looked even worse than before. Her shoulders were hunched tightly inward. One hand gripped the strap of her backpack while the other pressed against her stomach as if she were trying to hold something inside by force. Her pace was unsteady, and even from the road he could see the washed-out pallor in her face. Eldrick pulled over at once. He stepped out carefully, not wanting to startle her, but the moment she recognized him, the same alarm flashed across her face again. This time it came mixed with exhaustion, and because of that, it looked even more painful. She stopped walking but kept her distance, as though proximity itself had become dangerous in her world. Eldrick tried to keep his body language open, non-threatening, every instinct telling him not to press too hard. He could see now that she was trembling. Not from cold. From strain. Her eyes looked raw from crying, and the way she held herself told him she was either sick, injured, terrified, or all three. He tried to read the moment and failed. Maren did not soften. She did not take comfort in being recognized by the one adult who had actually paid attention. Instead, she reacted like a child who had learned that attention only made things worse. Her expression hardened around the edges with panic disguised as anger. That was when a middle-aged couple passing nearby slowed their pace and looked between them. To them, the scene likely appeared simple and ugly, an older man trying to engage a distressed teenage girl who clearly did not want to talk. Before Eldrick could explain, the couple moved closer to Maren, placing themselves between them with the protective reflex decent people have when they sense a child might be unsafe. The irony struck him hard. He was trying to protect her, yet from the outside he looked like the threat. He backed off immediately. Embarrassment burned through him, but it was drowned by something else when he got back into his car and glanced in the mirror. The couple moved on after a few moments, leaving Maren alone again on the sidewalk. She took only a few steps before doubling over near a trash can and vomiting hard enough that her entire frame shook. Eldrick froze behind the wheel, the sight hitting him like a punch to the chest. That was not nerves anymore. That was sickness. Real, physical sickness. The kind that fit far too well with the fear now growing inside him. He almost called 911 right then, but he hesitated, trapped between instinct and uncertainty. He had suspicions, but not proof of immediate danger. A girl was crying, hiding pills, vomiting, and terrified of being approached. It was enough to terrify him, but would it be enough for law enforcement to act? Would he only make things worse if officers arrived and found nothing they could justify intervening over? Maren had already shown she did not trust him. The couple had nearly called the police on him. One wrong move and he could lose the chance to help her at all. So instead of driving away, he parked across the street and watched from a distance, ashamed of how much it looked like surveillance, but unable to convince himself that leaving was the moral choice. Minutes later, the answer to one question arrived on its own. Maren entered a small liquor store at the corner, disappearing inside. Eldrick waited, eyes fixed on the entrance, every second stretching. Then Thaddeus Crowe emerged from the same store behind her. That explained why the house had been empty. He either worked there or owned it. He locked the door, flipped the sign, and followed Maren toward a parked sedan. From Eldrick's position, The stepfather's movements looked casual, almost ordinary, and that normalcy only made the entire scene more disturbing. Men who hid monsters beneath polite routines were often the hardest to recognize. Thaddeus handed Marin a drink before they got into the car. Eldrick could not tell whether it was soda or something worse. He only saw the way she accepted it without resistance, eyes lowered, spirit flattened. Then the sedan pulled away from the curb. Eldrick did not even fully decide to follow until his car was already moving. At first he kept a generous distance, telling himself he only wanted to see where they were going. If it turned out to be nothing, he could stop. If it turned out to be dangerous, he would at least know enough to speak with certainty. As he trailed them through side streets and gradually farther from the residential blocks, the sense of wrongness deepened. Families heading home in late afternoon did not usually drive in silence to the edge of town with a sick teenage girl who had spent the entire week weeping on a school bus. And still, Eldrick needed something more solid than dread. He needed another adult who might listen. He found one in Marin's homeroom teacher, Lenora Pike. He called her on speaker, keeping one eye on the road and the other on the sedan ahead. Lenora answered with surprise, but that surprise vanished quickly when Eldrick explained why he was calling. Unlike the principal, she listened. She had noticed things too. Marin was withdrawn in class, avoided eye contact, made frequent trips out of the room, and looked increasingly unwell. Earlier that same day, she had seemed so weak that Lenora had tried to send her to the nurse, only for the girl to disappear and later be found asleep in an unused theater room. The teacher had already raised concern with the principal and had been brushed off in much the same way Eldrick had. The moment he told her about the pills, the conversation shifted from worry to alarm. Eldrick sent the photos while still driving, and the silence on Lenora's end after she received them said enough. Now he was no longer the only one who saw the shape of the danger. Lenora urged caution. She said they should not act recklessly without knowing more. She also said she would try reaching Marin's mother through school records, because if the stepfather was involved in whatever this was, then the mother needed to know. Eldrick barely heard the last part. The sedan ahead had left the commercial area and was now heading toward the outer edge of town, where the neighborhoods gave way to open parkland and quieter roads. The direction alone made his stomach tighten. By the time he ended the call, the sky had begun to soften toward evening. The sedan continued on, steady and deliberate, until it finally turned into a large public park bordered by trees and walking paths. It was not deserted, but it was not busy either, just scattered families, a few joggers, patches of open space, and long shadows stretching across the grass. The sort of place that could look peaceful from a distance and isolated from the right angle. Thaddeus parked near an older maintenance area at the far side of the grounds. Eldrick parked several rows back, careful not to draw attention. Then he watched the two of them get out. Thaddeus carried a small cooler as if this was some harmless afternoon outing. Marin followed behind him, moving slowly, every step filled with the heaviness of someone walking toward something she did not want to face. Even from that distance, Eldrick could see there was no ease in her body. No sign of a normal family picnic. No relief. No trust. Just dread wrapped in obedience. He stayed inside the car for another second, feeling his pulse begin to hammer. Every choice he had made that day had led here. Every small decision to pay attention, to turn around, to look again, to keep following, had pulled him closer to whatever truth Marin had been hiding under that bus seat. And as he watched Thaddeus lead her deeper into the park with the cooler in one hand and certainty in his stride, Eldrick realized with a chill that this was no longer a suspicion waiting to be tested. It was a trap unfolding in real time. And somewhere ahead of him, in the quiet distance between the trees and the maintenance buildings, the worst part of Marin's secret was finally beginning to surface. Eldrick Boone stepped out of his car and followed at a distance, every instinct telling him to stay hidden, every second tightening the pressure in his chest. The park stretched wide and quiet under the fading light, but the further Thaddeus Crow led Marin, the more the space seemed to close in around them. They moved past the open picnic areas, past the scattered families, toward the far edge where the walking paths thinned out and the maintenance structures stood isolated, half forgotten behind rows of trees. It was not a place people wandered into without purpose. And whatever purpose Thaddeus had, it did not belong to anything normal. Marin walked a few steps behind him, her body language speaking louder than anything she could have said. Her shoulders were stiff, her head slightly lowered, her movements slow and reluctant, as if every step forward cost her something. There was no sign of anticipation, no trace of comfort in being with family. Only quiet resistance that never quite turned into defiance. Eldrick had seen that kind of movement before in people who felt they had no choice left. It was the posture of someone who had already tried to say no too many times and learned that it changed nothing. Thaddeus did not look back at her. He walked with steady confidence, carrying the cooler as if this were a routine he had repeated before. That detail struck Eldrick harder than anything else. This was not sudden. This was not chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate, practiced. The kind of behavior that came from knowing exactly what would happen next. Eldrick slowed as they approached the maintenance building, keeping enough distance to remain unnoticed. The structure sat at the edge of the park, a plain white shed with a single door and small, dusty windows placed too high to easily see through. It was the kind of building people ignored without thinking, locked most of the time, used only by staff, forgotten by visitors. A perfect place for something to happen without interruption. Then 3 men appeared. They approached from the opposite side of the building, moving casually at first glance, but there was something wrong in the way they carried themselves. Their attention locked onto Thaddeus immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition. One of them reached the door and pulled out a key. The moment the lock clicked open, the entire situation shifted from suspicion into certainty. Eldrick felt it in his bones. There was no reason for 4 grown men to bring a teenage girl into a locked maintenance shed in a quiet corner of a park. No explanation that could turn that image into something harmless. Every doubt he had been holding onto collapsed at once. This was not misunderstanding. This was not coincidence. This was something planned. His hand moved to his phone before he even fully realized the decision had been made. He stepped back behind a cluster of trees, lowering himself just enough to stay out of sight while keeping the building in view. His fingers shook as he dialed 911, but his voice, when it came, was controlled, urgent, precise. He gave the location, described what he had seen, explained that a minor had been led into a locked structure by multiple adult men. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He simply laid out the facts, each one heavier than the last. As he spoke, he kept his eyes fixed on the door. It had closed behind them. The operator asked questions, verifying details, assessing the situation. Eldrick answered quickly, watching the stillness of the building, feeling time stretch in a way that made every second feel dangerous. The operator confirmed that units were on the way, estimated arrival within minutes, and instructed him to keep his distance. Stay safe. Observe. Do not engage. Eldrick ended the call, but he did not move away. Distance no longer felt like safety. It felt like helplessness. He edged closer, staying low, moving carefully from one patch of cover to another. The ground beneath his feet seemed louder than it should have been, every small movement amplified by tension. He reached the side of the building where one of the high windows sat, its glass coated in a thin layer of dust. Standing on his toes, he wiped a small section clear with his sleeve and leaned just enough to look inside. What he saw froze him in place. The interior was dim, lit only by weak light filtering through the small windows. The 4 men stood around Marin, forming a loose circle that trapped her against the wall. She looked smaller than she had on the bus, smaller than she had on the sidewalk, as if the space itself had stripped away what little strength she had left. Her face was wet with tears. Her arms were drawn close to her body, protective, defensive, but not strong enough to push anyone away. Thaddeus stood closest to her. The way he leaned toward her, the way the others watched without intervening, the way the space felt closed around her, all of it confirmed what Eldrick had feared from the moment he found the pills. This was not a single moment of danger. This was the continuation of something that had already been happening, something that had pushed Maren into silence, into hiding, into sickness, into desperation. Eldrick's breath slowed, not from calm, but from the need to stay steady. The urge to act surged through him, raw and immediate. Every instinct told him to break the door, to rush inside, to pull her out of that space by force if necessary. But another part of him held him back, the part that understood the risk. 4 men. One of him. No idea what they might be capable of if cornered. The operator's warning echoed in his mind. Help was coming. Minutes away. Minutes. Inside, the tension shifted. Maren's posture tightened further, her body pressing back against the wall as if trying to merge with it. One of the men moved slightly closer, blocking the only clear path to the door. Thaddeus' focus never left her. The control in his stance, the certainty, the absence of hesitation, all of it made Eldrick realize just how calculated this situation was. This was not chaos. This was intent. And intent like that did not stop on its own. Eldrick stepped back from the window, his mind racing. Waiting felt unbearable. Acting felt dangerous. Every second stretched between those two options felt like a risk he could not measure. He glanced around, searching for anything, anyone, something that could shift the balance. That was when he heard footsteps behind him. 2 men in athletic clothing had approached along the path, slowing as they noticed him near the building. Their expressions carried the same initial suspicion he had seen earlier that day from the couple on the sidewalk. From their perspective, he was the one behaving strangely now, lingering near a locked structure, peering inside. For a fraction of a second, the situation threatened to turn against him again. But this time, there was no time for misunderstanding. Eldrick moved toward them, keeping his voice low, urgent, explaining what was happening inside in quick, controlled detail. He pointed to the building, described the girl, the men, the locked door. He told them help was on the way. He told them it might not be fast enough. The 2 men exchanged a look that said everything. They stepped closer to the window, each taking a turn to look inside. Whatever doubt they had vanished the moment they saw what Eldrick had seen. Their posture changed instantly, tension replacing hesitation, decision replacing uncertainty. They were no longer bystanders. They were part of the moment now. The air around the shed tightened. Inside, something shifted again. The stillness broke just enough to signal escalation, just enough to make it clear that waiting any longer might mean crossing a line that could not be undone. Eldrick felt the exact point where fear turned into resolve. The presence of the 2 runners beside him changed the equation. 3 against 4 was still not safe, still not ideal, but it was no longer impossible. And in that narrow gap between risk and necessity, the situation reached its breaking point. From somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of sirens began to rise. But they were not there yet. And inside that locked building, Maren Vale was still trapped. The moment stretched thin between action and waiting, and it was already breaking. Eldrick Boone felt it before anything actually moved, that invisible shift when hesitation could no longer hold the situation together. The distant sirens were growing louder, but not fast enough to quiet the dread pressing against his ribs. Inside the maintenance shed, Maren Vale was still surrounded, still trapped, and whatever control Thaddeus Crowe held over that space was tightening with every passing second. The two men beside Eldrick had seen enough. So had he. There was no longer any illusion left to hide behind. They moved. Not recklessly, but with the urgency of people who understood that delay carried its own kind of danger. The taller of the two runners stepped toward the door first, his posture firm, jaw set, his presence shifting from observer to obstacle. The second man followed just behind him, while Eldrick stayed slightly to the side, heart hammering, eyes locked on the handle of the door that separated them from whatever was happening inside. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the entire park had narrowed down to this single point. A sharp knock broke the silence. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, like those inside had frozen, listening, calculating. Then movement stirred behind the door, faint but undeniable. Eldrick's breath caught as every muscle in his body tensed. This was the edge. One step further and there would be no turning back. Then it came.
A muffled cry from inside, desperate, raw, unmistakable.
That sound erased the last trace of restraint. The runners did not hesitate again. The knocking turned forceful, urgent, demanding. Eldrick felt his pulse spike as the reality of the situation surged forward. Whatever doubt had existed outside that building was gone. This was no longer a suspicion, no longer a concern waiting for confirmation. This was a child calling for help from behind a locked door. And then, almost at the same time, the sirens arrived. The sound cut through the park, loud and immediate, breaking across the trees and open space with undeniable authority. Two police vehicles surged into view, lights flashing, tires crunching over gravel as they closed the distance in seconds. The sudden presence shifted everything. What had been hidden was now exposed. What had been controlled was now threatened. The officers moved fast. Doors opened, boots hit the ground, commands were issued with sharp precision. The atmosphere changed from tense uncertainty to controlled force in an instant. Eldrick stepped back slightly, the rush of relief mixing with adrenaline, but his eyes never left the shed. This was not over yet. Not until Marin was out. The door remained closed. The officers positioned themselves quickly, weapons drawn but steady, their movements practiced, efficient. One of them approached the entrance, issuing clear commands, giving those inside a chance to comply. For a second, it seemed like the situation might resolve cleanly. But that second passed, and the door did not open. The refusal said everything. The officers exchanged a brief signal. One of them moved back toward the patrol car and returned with a breaching tool. The space around the shed tightened again, but this time it was controlled tension, directed, purposeful. Eldrick watched as they prepared, his hands clenched at his sides, every nerve focused on what was about to happen. Then the door gave way. The impact was loud, splintering wood, the lock breaking under force. The officers moved in immediately, their presence filling the small space inside, voices commanding, overwhelming whatever resistance remained. For a fraction of a second, everything blurred together. Movement, sound, sudden chaos replacing the suffocating stillness that had existed just moments before. Then it resolved. 3 of the men dropped quickly, their compliance immediate once confronted with force they could not control. They fell to their knees, hands raised, the illusion of power gone as quickly as it had been built. But Thaddeus Crowe did not move the same way. He stayed standing. Near Marin. The defiance in his posture was unmistakable, the last flicker of control refusing to extinguish. Eldrick saw it clearly even from outside, the dangerous edge of someone who had just lost everything but had not yet accepted it. For a split second, it looked like the situation might turn violent. Thaddeus's hand moved toward a nearby object, his body shifting in a way that tightened every officer in the room. Time slowed. Every outcome hung in that moment. Then, just as quickly it broke. The object was dropped. The resistance collapsed. The weight of reality pressed down, and Thaddeus finally lowered himself, the defiance draining into reluctant submission. The officers closed in, securing him with practiced speed, removing any remaining threat. It was over. Or at least the most dangerous part was. Eldrick exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, his chest loosening as the tension released in a rush. The other men were being escorted out one by one, their earlier confidence replaced with hollow silence. As they passed, Eldrick caught a glimpse of Thaddeus's face, twisted with anger, his eyes locking onto Eldrick with a fury that needed no words. For a brief second, it felt like that anger might surge again, like he might break free and lash out. But the officers held him firmly, and the moment passed. Then Eldrick looked past them. Inside the shed, Maren was still on the floor. Curled in on herself, arms wrapped tightly around her body as if trying to hold herself together. The strength she had used to endure whatever had been happening inside those walls had finally given way. Now that the threat was gone, there was nothing left to hold it back. One of the officers, a woman, approached her slowly, lowering herself to her level, her posture careful, deliberate, designed not to frighten further but to reassure. Outside, the park had transformed. More vehicles arrived, additional police units, an ambulance, social services. Yellow tape stretched across the area, cutting off the quiet space that had, minutes earlier, hidden something unspeakable. People who had been walking the path slowed, watched from a distance, their curiosity held back by the clear authority of the scene. Eldrick remained where he was for a moment longer, his body heavy with the aftermath of adrenaline. The two runners who had stood beside him earlier were now giving statements, their faces still tense but steady. One of them glanced over and gave a small nod in Eldrick's direction, a silent acknowledgement of the choice that had brought them all here. Because it had been a choice. To notice. To question. To follow. To act. Eldrick finally stepped closer as the situation stabilized, careful, respectful, aware that this was no longer his moment to lead but to witness. Maren was being helped toward the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening air. Her face was still pale, still fragile, but something had changed in her eyes. The fear was not gone, not yet, but it was no longer alone. There was something else there now, something small but undeniable. Relief. And as Eldrick watched her, he realized that whatever came next, whatever truths would surface, whatever consequences would follow, one thing had already been decided. She was no longer trapped. And that had begun with a single glance in a mirror that most people would have ignored. The chaos of the park slowly settled into order, but for Eldrick Boone, everything had only just begun to unravel. The flashing lights, the voices of officers, the controlled movement of paramedics and social workers all blended into a scene that felt both overwhelming and strangely distant. Just an hour earlier, this had been an ordinary afternoon route, another quiet drive through familiar streets. Now it had become the turning point of a life that had nearly been destroyed in silence. Eldrick stood at the edge of it all, not as a hero, not as someone seeking recognition, but as the one person who had refused to look away when something felt wrong. Maren Vale sat at the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little to hide how small and fragile she looked. The tremors in her body had not fully stopped. Her hands remained clenched tightly in her lap, as if she still expected the world to shift against her at any second. A female paramedic checked her vitals while a social worker sat close beside her, speaking gently, guiding her through the first fragile moments of safety. Even without hearing a single word, Eldrick could see the hesitation in Maren's eyes. Safety was unfamiliar to her now. Trust had been broken too many times. He approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm her again. This time, she did not recoil. Her gaze lifted toward him, uncertain at first, then softening just enough to reveal something that had not been there before. Recognition. Not fear. Not rejection. Recognition. It was a small shift, but to Eldrick, it felt like the most important one of all. It meant that somewhere in the chaos of everything she had endured, she understood that he had been trying to help. The officers worked methodically nearby, gathering statements, documenting evidence, securing the scene. The 3 men who had accompanied Thaddeus Crowe were already being transported away, their involvement now part of a larger investigation that was only beginning to take shape. Thaddeus himself had been separated, restrained, removed from the area under heavy watch. The mask he had worn earlier, that cold, controlled composure, had cracked completely. What remained was anger, raw and exposed, directed outward at anything that had disrupted his control. Eldrick gave his statement in detail. He described everything from the first moment he noticed Maren crying on the bus to the discovery under the seat, the failed attempt to get help from the school, the encounter at the house, the sighting near the pharmacy, and the decision to follow. Every step, every observation, every choice he had made was laid out clearly. The officers listened carefully, taking notes, asking precise questions, building a timeline that would soon become evidence. What had begun as a feeling in the back of his mind was now forming into something solid, something undeniable. But the most important part came from Maren. Inside the ambulance, shielded from the noise and the lights, she began to speak. At first, it came slowly, fragmented, as if the words themselves were difficult to release. Fear had trained her to stay silent, to bury everything, to endure without drawing attention. Breaking that pattern required more than safety. It required the realization that the danger was truly over. That no one inside that shed could reach her again. When the truth finally surfaced, it confirmed everything Eldrick had feared, and more. The abuse had not started that day. It had been building in the shadows of her life, hidden behind routine, behind normal appearances, behind the illusion of a functioning home. Thaddeus had controlled her through fear, through threats, through manipulation that kept her isolated and silent. The pills Eldrick had found were not a sign of rebellion. They were a desperate attempt to fix something she did not fully understand, something she had been too afraid to tell anyone about. Her body had begun to change, to react, to show signs she could not ignore, and with no safe adult to turn to, she had tried to solve it alone. The weight of it hit Eldrick harder than anything he had seen that day. A child, trying to manage a nightmare in secret, believing that silence was the only way to survive it. The ambulance doors closed shortly after, and Maren was taken to the hospital under supervision. Eldrick was asked to follow, not as a suspect, not as a witness being held, but as someone who had become part of the situation in a way that could not be separated. He agreed without hesitation. Walking away now was no longer an option. The hospital was bright, clinical, indifferent to the emotional storm that had arrived with them. Maren was taken in immediately for examination. Doctors moved with quiet efficiency, nurses guiding her through procedures designed to determine the full extent of her condition. Eldrick waited outside, seated in a hard plastic chair that offered no comfort, only time. Time to think. Time to process. Time to realize just how close everything had come to ending differently. He replayed the moments again. The mirror. The tears. The hesitation. The decision to check under the seat. The choice to turn the car around. The decision to follow. Each one had been small on its own. None of them had felt like certainty at the time. But together, they had formed a path that led directly to this moment. After what felt like hours, a social worker approached him. The update was clear, direct, and heavy. Maren was pregnant. Early stage, but confirmed. The reality settled over Eldrick like a weight he could not shake. It was no longer suspicion, no longer fear of what might be true. It was fact. The situation was not just criminal. It was devastating on a level that would follow her long after the immediate danger had passed. Not long after, her family arrived. Her mother, Laura Vale, rushed into the hospital with urgency and confusion written across her face, followed closely by her own mother. They had been contacted by authorities, pulled abruptly into a reality they had not seen coming. The moment Laura reached her daughter's room, the emotional barrier broke completely. The distance, the absence, the trust that had been misplaced, all of it collided at once. The truth spread quickly. Shock, denial, grief, guilt. Each emotion surfaced in turn, raw and unfiltered. Laura struggled to understand how something so severe could have happened under her own roof, how the man she had trusted had been capable of such cruelty. The answers were not simple. They never were in situations like this. Predators did not reveal themselves easily. They built trust carefully, hid behind normalcy, and struck where no one was looking. Eldrick remained at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but he was drawn back into the moment when Maren asked for him. When he entered the room, she looked smaller than ever, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, wrapped in a gown that seemed too large for her. But her eyes found him immediately. This time, there was no fear in them. Only something fragile, something new, something that had begun to take shape the moment the door of that shed had been broken open. Relief mixed with trust. He stayed only briefly, offering quiet reassurance through presence rather than words, allowing the family and the professionals to take over what came next. This was no longer his role to lead. His role had been to see, to act, to intervene at the exact moment when it mattered most. Outside the room, a police officer approached him again with further information. Thaddeus Crowe was not an isolated case. The investigation had already begun to uncover a pattern, a history that extended beyond Maren. The 3 men found with him were cooperating, offering details in exchange for reduced charges. What they revealed painted a darker picture, one that suggested this had not been a single act, but part of something more calculated, more deliberate, more predatory than anyone had first assumed. Eldrick listened in silence. The weight of it all settled deeper, but alongside it came something else. Certainty. He had not been wrong. And more importantly, he had not been too late. As he finally stepped out into the cool night air, the noise of the hospital fading behind him, Eldrick realized that nothing about that day had been ordinary. It had started with a small, almost invisible moment, a girl crying quietly on a bus, and it had ended with a life pulled back from the edge of something far worse. But even as relief settled in, one truth remained clear. This was not the end of Maren's story. It was only the moment she had been given a chance to survive it. The night did not end when Eldrick Boone stepped out of the hospital, and neither did the weight of everything that had unfolded. What had been uncovered inside that small maintenance shed was not something that could be contained within a single rescue, a single arrest, or a single report. It was the kind of truth that spread outward, touching every life connected to it, forcing each person to confront something they had not seen, or had not wanted to see, until it was too late. Inside the hospital, Maren Vale's world had already begun to shift into something unfamiliar. For the first time in months, she was no longer under the shadow of fear that followed her from room to room, from night into morning, from silence into forced obedience. But freedom did not arrive as relief alone. It came tangled with confusion, exhaustion, and the overwhelming weight of what had been done to her. The medical examinations confirmed what her body had already been trying to tell her in quiet, frightening signals she did not understand. The early pregnancy was real. The damage, both physical and emotional, was real. And the path forward would not be simple. Her mother, Laura Vale, remained at her side, no longer distant, no longer unaware. The truth had shattered whatever illusion had once existed between them. The absence that had left Maren vulnerable was now replaced with a presence that refused to leave again. Guilt settled heavily on Laura, but it did not paralyze her. Instead, it hardened into something protective, something determined. She could not undo what had happened, but she could make sure it never happened again. Outside the room, systems began to move. Authorities built their case with precision, layering testimony, physical evidence, and the statements from the other men involved. Thaddeus Crowe was no longer just a suspect. He was the center of an investigation that grew more severe with each detail uncovered. Patterns emerged quickly. His behavior had not been isolated. His methods had not been accidental. He had chosen his circumstances carefully, positioning himself in a place of trust, exploiting vulnerability, and maintaining control through fear and silence. Now that silence had been broken, and what followed would not stop with a single arrest. The school, too, was forced to confront its own failure. The overlooked signs, the dismissed concerns, the reluctance to act without certainty, all of it came under scrutiny. Questions were raised about responsibility, about awareness, about the cost of hesitation when a child is clearly struggling. Policies would be reviewed. Procedures would be rewritten. But none of it would change the fact that the warning signs had been there, visible enough for one bus driver to notice, yet easy enough for others to overlook. And at the center of it all stood Eldrick Boone. He returned to his routine in the days that followed, but nothing about it felt the same. The bus still followed the same route. The students still filled the seats with noise and distraction. The mirrors still reflected the same rows of faces. But now, every glance carried more weight. Every quiet student, every withdrawn expression, every small shift in behavior stood out more sharply than before. He had always paid attention, but now attention had become something deeper, something deliberate. Because he knew what could be hidden beneath silence. He did not speak about what had happened unless asked. He did not seek recognition or praise. When others referred to him as the man who saved that girl, he brushed it aside in the same quiet way he approached everything else. In his mind, he had not done anything extraordinary. He had simply refused to ignore what he saw. But that refusal had made all the difference. Maren's recovery was not immediate. There were decisions to be made, difficult ones that no 14-year-old should ever have to face. Medical care continued. Psychological support became essential. The future that had once seemed straightforward was now uncertain, shaped by choices that carried weight far beyond her years. But through all of it, one thing remained steady. She was no longer alone. The fear that had once controlled her no longer dictated her silence. It would take time for trust to rebuild, for strength to return, for the fragments of her life to come together in a way that felt whole again. There would be setbacks. There would be moments where the past pressed too close. But there would also be something new, support, protection, and the knowledge that someone had seen her when she thought she was invisible. That knowledge mattered more than anything else. Because in the end, the story was not only about what had been done to her. It was about what had been prevented. If Eldrick Boone had dismissed the tears as ordinary sadness, if he had trusted the easy explanation, if he had chosen comfort over concern, the outcome would have been very different. The moment would have passed. The pattern would have continued. The silence would have held. But he did not look away. And because of that, a chain of small decisions became something powerful enough to interrupt a nightmare before it could go further. It did not erase what had already happened. Nothing could do that. But it stopped what might have come next. As the days moved forward and the case built toward justice, the meaning of that moment became clearer. Change does not always begin with strength or authority. Sometimes, it begins with something far quieter. A glance in a mirror. A feeling that something is wrong. And the courage to act on it, even when there is no proof, no certainty, no guarantee. Eldrick Boone returned to his seat behind the wheel, hands steady on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the road ahead. The bus moved forward as it always had. Life continued, carrying with it all the noise and distraction that so easily hides what matters. But now, there was a difference. Now, he knew that even the smallest moment could change everything. And somewhere beyond the routine, beyond the noise, beyond the ordinary flow of days, a girl who had once believed she was alone was still alive, still standing, still given a chance to rebuild her life. Not because the world had been watching, but because one person had.